A single photograph, taken in 1888 in a modest portrait studio. A black family dressed in their finest clothes, gazing directly into the camera with quiet dignity. For over a century, this image sat forgotten in an archive, just another relic of the past. But when modern geneticists used advanced imaging technology to examine the matriarch's eyes, they discovered something extraordinary, a pattern in her irises that should have been impossible. A genetic signature that traced back across the ocean, through centuries of history, to African royalty that the world had forgotten. This wasn't just a family portrait. It was evidence of a bloodline that slavery tried to erase. If you want to discover how one photograph rewrote history and reunited a family with their royal heritage, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. You won't believe where this story goes. Doctor? Maya Richardson stood in the basement of the Smithsonian Institution, surrounded by cardboard boxes that smelled of dust and time. She had been working on the African American Heritage Photography Project for 3 months, cataloging thousands of images from the post-Civil War era. Most were damaged, faded, or barely identifiable. But this particular morning in March 2019, she opened a box labeled Virginia Studios, 1880-1890, and found something that made her pause. The photograph was remarkably well preserved, a family of 6, seated and standing in a formal studio arrangement. The backdrop showed a painted garden scene, typical of the era. The father stood tall in a dark suit, one hand resting on the shoulder of his seated wife. 4 children surrounded them, 2 boys, 2 girls, all dressed in their Sunday best. Their expressions were solemn, dignified, almost regal. Maya lifted the photograph carefully, noting the photographer's stamp on the back. J. Morrison Studio, Richmond, Virginia, September 1888. She had seen hundreds of similar portraits, but something about this one felt different. The family's posture, the way they held themselves, suggested a pride that transcended their circumstances. She placed the image on her light table and reached for her magnifying glass, beginning her standard documentation process. Age, condition, subjects, location. But when she leaned in to examine the details more closely, her breath caught. The woman at the center, the matriarch, had the most striking eyes Maya had ever seen in a photograph from this period. Even through the sepia tones and the limitations of 19th century photography, there was something unusual about them. A clarity that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of 1888. Maya sat back, frowning. She had worked with historical photographs for years, and she knew what was typical for the era. The early emulsion processes, the long exposure times, the primitive lenses, they all created specific limitations. Eyes in these old portraits were usually dark, somewhat blurred, lacking detail. But this woman's eyes were different, sharp, almost luminous, and there was a pattern visible in the irises that Maya couldn't quite make out with her magnifying glass alone. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly noon. Her colleague, Dr. James Chen, worked in the digital imaging laboratory upstairs. If anyone could help her see what she was seeing, or prove she was imagining it, it was him. Maya carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and headed for the elevator. James looked up from his computer screen when Maya entered the imaging lab, carrying the protective sleeve like it contained something precious. He had worked with her long enough to recognize that look, the one that said she had found something interesting. "What have you got?" he asked, pushing his chair back from the desk. "I'm not sure yet," Maya admitted, laying the photograph gently on the scanning bed. "But there's something about this woman's eyes. I need you to scan it at the highest resolution possible." James raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. He had learned to trust Maya's instincts. He adjusted the settings on the professional grade scanner, designed specifically for archival work, and initiated the process. The machine hummed softly as it captured every microscopic detail of the 131-year-old image. 5 minutes later, the scan appeared on his monitor. James opened the file in specialized imaging software and began to zoom in on the matriarch's face. Maya stood beside him, her hand gripping the back of his chair. "There," she whispered, pointing at the screen. "Do you see it?" James leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. Then he zoomed in further, focusing entirely on the woman's left eye. The iris filled the screen, and what they saw made both of them fall silent. The pattern was unmistakable. Even through the limitations of 19th century photography, even through 131 years of aging, the structure of her iris showed a distinctive configuration. Deep radial furrows, unusually pronounced collarette, and a specific arrangement of crypts that formed an almost geometric pattern. "That's," James began, then stopped. He opened another window on his computer and pulled up a database he had been working with for a different project, a genetic iris pattern recognition system developed by the National Institute of Health. He input the pattern from the photograph, adjusting for the image quality and age. The software ran for 30 seconds, comparing the pattern against thousands of documented genetic markers. When the results appeared, James sat back hard in his chair. "Maya, this pattern is linked to a specific genetic lineage. It's extremely rare. We're talking about something that appears in less than 1% of the global population. He scrolled through the data, his expression growing more serious, and according to this, it's associated with a particular ancestral line from West Central Africa. Maya felt her heart racing. Can you be more specific? James clicked through several more screens, then turned to look at her directly. Angola, specifically the royal lineages of pre-colonial Ndongo Kingdom. 2 days later, Maya sat across from Dr. Patricia Okonkwo in a small office at Howard University. Patricia was one of the foremost genealogists specializing in African American family histories, particularly those tracing back to the era of slavery. Her walls were covered with family trees, maps of the Atlantic slave trade routes, and photographs of people she had helped reconnect with their heritage. Maya had brought both the original photograph and James's digital analysis. She watched as Patricia examined everything with the careful attention of someone who understood that these fragments of the past were all that remained for many families. The iris pattern is definitive? Patricia asked, looking up from the genetic report. According to the NIH database, yes, Maya confirmed. This specific configuration is linked to a genetic marker found almost exclusively in descendants of the Ndongo royal family. The kingdom of Ndongo. I know the history, Patricia interrupted gently. Queen Nzinga, one of Africa's greatest leaders. She resisted Portuguese colonization for nearly 40 years. She looked back down at the photograph. And you're telling me this woman, photographed in Richmond, Virginia in 1888, carries her bloodline? That's what the genetic evidence suggests. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, studying the matriarch's face. Do we have any information about the family? Names? Anything written on the photograph? Maya shook her head. Just the studio stamp. J. Morrison Studio in Richmond. I've been searching through Richmond city records from that period, but without names, it's nearly impossible. These. Patricia reached for her laptop and opened a database she had compiled over 20 years of research. Morrison Studio. I know that name. John Morrison was one of the few photographers in Richmond who regularly took portraits of black families during that era. He kept detailed ledgers. She typed rapidly. I have copies of some of his records. Let me see. She scrolled through scanned pages of handwritten entries, squinting at the faded ink. Dates, names, payment amounts, descriptions of sittings. Here, she said suddenly, turning the screen toward Maya. September 14th, 1888. Family portrait. 6 subjects. Name given as... She paused, reading carefully. The Thomas family. No first names listed, but there's an address. 412 Clay Street, Richmond. Maya leaned forward, her pulse quickening. That's them? It has to be. Same date, same number of people. Morrison charged them $2. That was expensive for the time. They saved money for this portrait. Patricia's expression softened. They wanted to be remembered. Maya arrived in Richmond on a gray Thursday morning. The city had changed dramatically since 1888, but traces of its past remained in the old neighborhoods. The brick buildings, the church steeples that still rose above the modern skyline. She went directly to the Library of Virginia, where Patricia had arranged access to the city directories and census records from the late 19th century. The research room was quiet, occupied only by a handful of other historians and genealogists bent over their own investigations into the past. A librarian named Mr. Lawson brought her the materials she had requested. Richmond city directories from 1885 to 1890, census records from 1880 and 1900, and property tax records from the same period. Maya started with the 1888 directory. She ran her finger down the listings for Clay Street, searching for number 412. The entries were organized by street, then by number, with the head of household's name and occupation listed. There it was, 412, Clay Street, Thomas, Samuel, Carpenter. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote it down. Samuel Thomas. The man standing in the photograph, his hand on his wife's shoulder. A carpenter. She immediately moved to the 1880 census, searching for Samuel Thomas in Richmond. She found him on the 4th page she examined. Samuel Thomas, age 24, black, carpenter. Born in Virginia. And listed below him, his wife, whose name made Maya's breath catch. Grace Thomas, age 22, born in Virginia. Grace. The matriarch had a name now. Maya stared at the census entry, then looked at the notes column. Most entries were blank or contained simple occupations, but next to Grace's name, someone had written in small, cramped handwriting, midwife, healer. Maya continued down the census page. 4 children were listed: Robert, age 5, Elizabeth, age 4, Thomas Jr. She age 2, and Mary, age 1, the same 4 children in the photograph 8 years later. But it was the next entry that made Maya sit up straight. Under a section labeled Parents' Birthplace, there were 2 columns, one for father, one for mother. For both Samuel and Grace, the father's birthplace was listed as Virginia, but for Grace's mother, someone had written unknown, possibly foreign. In 1880, for a black woman in Virginia, that notation was extraordinary. It suggested something unusual about Grace's background, something that didn't fit the typical narrative of enslaved people born in the American South. Maya pulled out her phone and texted Patricia. Found them, Samuel and Grace Thomas, and there's something unusual about Grace's mother. Patricia called her back within minutes. Churches, she said without preamble. If Grace was a midwife and healer in the black community, the churches would have records. Baptisms, marriages, funerals. They kept better records than the city did, especially for black families. Maya spent the rest of the day visiting historically black churches in Richmond. Many had been destroyed or relocated over the decades, but 3 still stood from the 1880s. First African Baptist Church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and St. Philip's Episcopal Church. It was at Ebenezer Baptist, in a dusty archive room that smelled of old paper and lemon oil, that she found what she was looking for. Reverend Marcus Williams, a man in his 70s who served as the church's unofficial historian, brought her a leather-bound ledger from 1875. We've kept every record since 1802, he said with quiet pride. Baptisms, marriages, deaths. This community has always known that memory matters. Maya opened the ledger carefully. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, each entry noting names, dates, and often brief personal details. She searched through the baptism records first, looking for the Thomas children. She found them. Robert, baptized in 1876, Elizabeth in 1877, Thomas Jr. in 1879, Mary in 1880. All 4 children, their parents, listed as Samuel and Grace Thomas. But then she turned back further to 1874 and found an entry that made her heart race. Marriage, Samuel Thomas to Grace Oladale, October 3rd, 1874. Witnesses, Jacob Freeman, Ruth Freeman. Oladale, not a common name in Virginia, not a common name anywhere in America in 1874. Maya's hands trembled as she took a photograph of the page with her phone. Reverend Williams leaned over her shoulder, reading the entry. Oladale, he said slowly. That's a Yoruba name, from Nigeria. He paused. But many enslaved people from Angola were given Yoruba names by slave traders. The cultures got mixed together during the Middle Passage. Maya looked up at him. Is there anything else about Grace? Any other records? The Reverend thought for a moment, then moved to another shelf. He pulled down a different ledger, this one from the 1870s. We have some personal testimonies from that era. People who joined the church had to give their testimony, tell their story. He flipped through the pages, then stopped. Here, Grace Oladale joined the church in 1873, before her marriage. There's a note here from Reverend Johnson. Maya read the faded handwriting. Grace came to us with unusual knowledge of healing herbs, claims her mother taught her. Mother deceased. Grace refuses to speak of her origins. Maya returned to Washington with more questions than answers. She had a name, Grace Oladale, but the mystery had only deepened. Why would Grace refuse to speak of her origins? What had happened to her mother? And most importantly, how did a woman living in post-Civil War Virginia carry the genetic signature of Angolan royalty? Back at the Smithsonian, she met with James and Patricia via video conference. James had been running additional analyses on the iris pattern, comparing it against expanded genetic databases. Patricia had been searching through slave ship manifests and auction records, looking for any mention of the name Oladale. I found something, Patricia said, her face serious on the screen. There was a slave ship called the Esperanza that docked in Charleston, South Carolina in 1847. Portuguese vessel. It came from Luanda, Angola. The cargo manifest listed 217 enslaved people, though I'm certain there were more who died during the crossing. Maya leaned closer to her screen. Did you find the name Oladale? No, but I found something else. There's a notation about a woman and her young daughter who were separated from the main group when they arrived. They were described as special acquisition and sold privately, not at the regular auction. The notation says the woman claimed to be of royal blood. The room fell silent. James spoke first. Do we have any way to confirm this woman was Grace's mother? Not directly, Patricia admitted, but the timing fits. If Grace was born around 1858, as the census suggests, and her mother arrived in 1847, she could have been pregnant when she was enslaved or shortly after. The fact that they were sold privately suggests someone believed their claim about royal heritage, or at least saw them as valuable for other reasons. Maya stared at the photograph on her desk. Grace's face, captured in that Richmond studio in 1888, seemed to look back at her across the decades. We need to find out what happened to that woman and her daughter after they were sold in Charleston. Where did they go? How did they end up in Virginia? Patricia nodded. I'll search the Charleston private sale records. Some wealthy families kept detailed records of their purchases, especially if they paid premium prices. And I'll keep working on the genetic analysis, James added. If we can find any living descendants of the Thomas family, we might be able to confirm the royal lineage definitively through DNA testing. Maya picked up the photograph again, studying Grace's eyes. Somewhere in those eyes was a story that had been hidden for over 170 years, a story of queens and kingdoms, of survival and silence. 3 weeks later, Patricia called Maya with news that changed everything. She had found the private sale record in the archives of the Middleton family, a wealthy Charleston plantation dynasty that had kept meticulous records of their acquisitions. Her name was Nzinga, Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. The woman who arrived on the Esperanza in 1847 was named Nzinga. The buyer, Charles Middleton, noted in his private ledger that she claimed to be descended from Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. He didn't believe her, but he bought her anyway because she was young and strong. The child with her was approximately 2 years old. He didn't record the child's name. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it. Nzinga. She named herself after the queen. Or maybe she really was descended from her. There's more, Patricia continued. The ledger says Nzinga was sold again in 1852 to a Virginia tobacco plantation owner named Richard Blackwell. She and her daughter both. Blackwell's plantation was about 30 miles south of Richmond. What happened to them there? I don't know yet, but I found a notation in the Blackwell family papers at the Virginia Historical Society. I'm driving up tomorrow to look at them. Do you want to meet me there? The next afternoon, Maya and Patricia sat in the reading room of the Virginia Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of Blackwell family documents. They found the notation in a letter dated 1858, written by Richard Blackwell's wife, Eleanor, to her sister in Maryland. Eleanor wrote, "The African woman Nzinga died in childbirth last week. She delivered a girl child who survived. The infant is remarkably beautiful, with unusual eyes. I have decided to keep the child in the house to be trained as a lady's maid. The other daughter, who must be nearly 13 now, works in the kitchen. She has her mother's healing knowledge and has saved 3 of our children from fever this year alone. Richard wants to sell her, but I have forbidden it." Maya looked at Patricia. "The baby born in 1858. That would be Grace. And the older daughter was her half-sister, born in Africa or during the voyage." Patricia's hands trembled as she turned the page. "This means Grace never knew her mother. Nzinga died the day Grace was born." They sat in silence, imagining the scene. A woman dying in childbirth on a Virginia plantation, far from her homeland, far from the royal heritage she had carried across the ocean. And a newborn girl opening her eyes for the first time, carrying in her irises the genetic proof of her ancestry. Maya knew that proving the genetic connection would require finding living descendants of Samuel and Grace Thomas. The photograph and the historical records told a compelling story, but DNA evidence would make it undeniable. She started with the 1900 census, tracing what had happened to the family after the photograph was taken. Samuel had died in 1895, but Grace had lived until 1912. The 4 children from the photograph had grown up, married, and had children of their own. The trail led Maya to a woman named Dorothy Williams, who lived in Philadelphia. Dorothy was 76 years old, and according to the genealogical records Patricia had compiled, she was the great-great-granddaughter of Robert Thomas, the oldest son in the photograph. Maya called her on a Tuesday evening, her heart pounding. The phone rang 3 times before a warm voice answered. "Mrs. Williams, my name is Dr. Maya Richardson. I'm a historian with the Smithsonian Institution, and I've been researching your family history. I found a photograph from 1888 that I believe shows your great-great-grandparents." There was a long pause. "You found a picture of my people?" "Yes, ma'am. Your great-great-grandfather Samuel Thomas, your great-great-grandmother Grace, and their 4 children. It was taken in Richmond, Virginia." Dorothy's voice broke. "We don't have any pictures from back then. Not a single one. The family stories say there was a portrait made once, but it was lost during the Depression when my grandmother had to move. We always wished we could see their faces." Maya felt tears in her own eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I'd like to come visit you and show you the photograph. But there's something else. We've made a discovery about your great-great-grandmother Grace. Something remarkable about her ancestry. Would you be willing to take a DNA test?" "What kind of discovery?" Maya chose her words carefully. "We have evidence that suggests Grace was the daughter of a woman who came from Angola, from a royal lineage. Her genetic markers indicate she may have been descended from one of the most powerful queens in African history." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Maya thought the call had dropped. Then Dorothy spoke, her voice steady despite the emotion in it. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about Grace. She said Grace had healing hands, that she could look at you and see what was wrong, deep inside. She said Grace had eyes that seemed to know things, ancient things." Dorothy paused. "And she said Grace always told her children, 'Remember that you come from kings and queens. Never forget that.'" 6 weeks later, Maya returned to Philadelphia with James and Patricia. They met Dorothy in her living room. where 3 generations of her family had gathered. Her daughter, Karen, sat beside her. Her grandson, Marcus, a college student studying history, stood by the window. All of them wanted to know the truth. James opened his laptop and pulled up the genetic analysis results. He had compared Dorothy's DNA sample against the markers identified in Grace's iris pattern from the photograph, and then cross-referenced everything with genetic databases from Angola. "The results are definitive," he began. "Dorothy, you carry the same genetic markers that we identified in your great-great-grandmother's eyes. These markers are extremely rare, found in less than 0.1% of the global population, and they match the genetic signature of the Ndongo royal family." He pulled up a chart showing the genetic lineage. Queen Nzinga ruled the kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba from 1624 to 1663. She resisted Portuguese colonization for nearly 40 years, protecting her people and their independence. According to the genetic evidence, Grace was her direct descendant, approximately 7 generations removed. Dorothy's hand went to her mouth. Karen reached over and gripped her mother's other hand. Marcus moved closer, staring at the screen. "How is that possible?" Marcus asked. "How did a queen's descendant end up enslaved in Virginia?" Patricia spoke up, sharing what they had discovered in the archives. She told them about Nzinga, the woman who arrived on the Esperanza in 1847 claiming royal blood, about how she was sold to the Blackwell plantation, about how she died giving birth to Grace in 1858, never having returned to her homeland. "Your great-great-grandmother Grace never knew her mother," Patricia said gently, "but she carried her legacy in every cell of her body, in her healing knowledge, passed down from her older half-sister, and in her eyes, those distinctive eyes that showed her royal heritage." Maya placed the photograph on the coffee table. Dorothy leaned forward, seeing her ancestors' faces for the first time. She traced her finger over Grace's image, over those remarkable eyes that had looked into the camera lens in 1888, carrying a secret that would take 131 years to uncover. "She looks like my grandmother," Dorothy whispered, "and like my mother, and like Karen." She looked up at Maya, tears streaming down her face. "All this time we had the stories, but we never had proof. We never had this." Marcus picked up the photograph carefully. "She looks like a queen." "Because she was descended from one," James said quietly. 3 months later, on a warm September afternoon, exactly 131 years after the original photograph was taken, Dorothy and her family stood in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The photograph that had started everything was now part of a permanent collection, alongside the documentation of Grace's royal lineage. But this gathering wasn't about exhibitions or displays. It was about family. Dorothy had worked with Patricia to trace every branch of the Thomas family tree, and today, more than 40 descendants of Samuel and Grace Thomas had come together from across the country. Many were meeting each other for the first time. Maya watched as they gathered around a large screen showing the digitally restored photograph. She saw Grace's features, reflected in face after face, the same strong jaw, the same dignified bearing, and in several people, those same distinctive eyes. An older man named Joseph, who traveled from Atlanta, stood staring at the image of his great-great-grandfather Samuel. "I have his carpentry tools," he said quietly. "They've been passed down through my family. I never knew what he looked like until today." A young woman named Aaliyah, Dorothy's great-niece, stood beside her. She had Grace's eyes, that same unusual iris pattern that had started the entire investigation. When James had tested her DNA as part of the expanded family study, the royal genetic markers had been unmistakable. "I always felt like there was something about our family," Aaliyah said. "Some story we were missing. My grandmother used to say we came from greatness, but she didn't know how or why. She just felt it." Dorothy addressed the gathered family, her voice strong. Grace died in 1912, never knowing that the truth about her mother would be discovered. She never knew that science would one day prove what her mother Nzinga had claimed, that they were descended from a warrior queen who defied an empire. But she knew her worth, she knew her strength, and she made sure we knew ours. She looked around at the faces of her family, doctors, teachers, artists, parents, students, all of them carrying Grace's legacy forward into the future. "This photograph was meant to be a memory," Dorothy continued. Samuel and Grace paid $2 they could barely afford so their children would remember their faces. But it became more than that. It became evidence. Proof that our ancestors were not just survivors. They were royalty. And that is something no one can ever take away from us again. Marcus raised his phone and took a photograph of everyone gathered together. History repeating itself. Another family portrait. Another moment preserved. But this time, they knew who they were.